Are you tired? Maybe lacking motivation? You've got adrenal fatigue, right? But there's no such thing. Kind of. I'm Dr. Sarah. Today I want to talk to you about why there's such a controversy right now in naturopathic functional medicine and conventional medicine surrounding the term adrenal fatigue. The precision of wording in medicine is of utmost importance. So if you want to play your odds at getting some practitioners to go hyperbolic, say the term adrenal fatigue. In 1 minute, you're going to be eyeing the nearest exit to escape that long-winded explanation of its non-existence. And you'll probably be berating me for even daring you to say such a polarized term. Or you'll be getting a gentle correction in phrasing along with an explanation of the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis. That's in reference to the communication between those three glands. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Basically, words can trigger people, and that's a subject for another video or post in an expert in psychology or sociology. What I want to talk about is, even though that this term may be bothersome, because it is nonspecific to physician, and I can understand that, but I'm not really sure why it's so downright controversial in medicine. Maybe what I think that we should do instead is try to understand the underlying physiology before we dismiss it entirely. Let's take, for example, the words leaky gut. Now, that was used by naturopathic doctors for years, and they were criticized and ridiculed for believing in such woo-woo. But then the microbiome, which is the population of the microbes that inhabit the intestines and their genes, that came into vogue. And with all the attention and the gastrointestinal system and more research, money to explore it, the term intestinal permeability now populates most medical journals. See, NDs have gained scientific validation and vindication that the gut does, in fact, get leaky. But caution's warranted because, again, you want to say the word intestinal permeability because that's the proper reference for the breakdown in the barrier of the intestinal lining, which is now linked to various disease processes. So similarly to leaky gut, adrenal fatigue refers to a dysfunctional organ. It's not a disease in and of itself, but it does come with a lot of symptoms. And so what I want to do is put aside semantics, and I want to discuss in this video the theory of adrenal fatigue. And this will help you get a greater appreciation of how your endocrine system and your endocrine glands can impact your mind and your body. I want to go over the controversy surrounding the wording of the dysfunction in adrenal glands, which we just did a little bit, and we'll go into it a little bit more. The link between the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis and adrenal dysregulation, the impact of cortisol and corticosteroids arising from the adrenal glands on body processes and physiology, and what adrenal fatigue is actually referring to. So that's a little snippet of what we're going to go over in this video. Now, if you want to get more references and resources to what's discussed, make sure you check out the link to the accompanying article in the video description. You'll also find resources on some of my classes, some of my offerings, and you can also subscribe to my newsletter so you won't miss any videos or any additional articles that I release. Okay, let's get started. What is the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis? Say that 6 times fast. This is why we shortened it to the HPA axis. But in order to understand adrenal fatigue, we have to talk about the HPA axis. Now, this is the concept about how these 3 endocrine organs communicate through this feedback loop. And what the HPA axis does is it links the central nervous system to the endocrine system. So the nervous system and your hormones are communicating together. It regulates the balances of these hormones in the body, especially related to the stress response. So how the HPA axis is linked to various symptoms, we have to step back to how it actually works in the body, the physiology and the interactions between these 3 glands. So first of all, there's a positive and a negative feedback mechanism, meaning that one hormone will make more hormones and then another hormone will signal to stop the making of that hormone, and it kind of goes back in the opposite direction. Now, the hypothalamus contains neuroendocrine neurons, so in other words, nervous system and hormone connecting neurons that produce this cortico-releasing hormone, or CRH, and they secrete it out. And when the pituitary gland gets a signal from the CRH, what that'll do is it signals the pituitary to release the next hormone, which is ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the way that they're named kind of tells you what they're stimulating and where they're going. So the ACTH then induces the adrenal gland to synthesize and release corticosteroids, right? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, most of it from the adrenal glands. Now, cortisol is produced in the adrenal glands through this conversion of cholesterol into its final structure. Now, this is through that stimulation of ACTH, but most of the hormone that's floating around in your blood right now is going to be bound to proteins, the corticosteroid binding globulin or albumin. And that's so it keeps this powerful hormone inactivated until it reaches its target tissues. So see, there's all these little travel arrangements that hormones have to make in our bodies to get to where they need to go effectively. Now, when the body senses that there's enough cortisol, ACTH and CRH stimulation ceases, and an enzyme converts cortisol to its inactive form, cortisone. And that happens in the kidneys and the pancreas. Now, CRH, which was that stimuli from the hypothalamus, is actually influenced also by levels of neuroepinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine. And we get this fast response first, which is the release of these mediators, and it also includes adrenaline, which we get that fast stress response. And these change our physiology and behavior as well through this neuroendocrine link. Now, what happens is if this axis gets dysregulated, we can get a breakdown in the mind and the body. Basically, there's been links into dysregulation and these signaling patterns between brain and liver pathologies, cardiovascular disease, inflammation, a suboptimal immune response, pregnancy and fertility issues, depression, and anxiety. If we look at kind of why this happens, we have to look at what these corticosteroids and cortisol does in our body. So we've gone over the terminology in medicine. Just dialing it back a little for you. We've talked about the HPA axis, and the HPA axis is what's going to produce these corticosteroids or this cortisol, the end result. And these are going to have major effects in our body. Now, cortisol, the stress hormone, is probably the most studied or at least cited in the literature right now. And it is what's highlighted when we talk about adrenal fatigue. It is actually going to dial down our rest, digest, and reproductive functions and upregulate our fight, flee, or freeze responses. So everything that is not related to survival and getting through the next few minutes is shut down so that the body can survive. So things that cortisol will do is it'll increase our breathing rate. It's going to slow down our digestive tract and our reproductive functions. It's going to enhance skeletal muscle tone, specifically to the periphery, so we can run if we need to, increase our blood glucose, right? So we have the energy we need to fight off whatever we need to fight off. It breaks down fat to get more energy, so it's catabolic. Long term, you might even see some muscle wasting in people who've been stressed for a long period of time. It increases heart rate and blood pressure. It can suppress inflammation. Now, you might think this is a good thing, but remember, your body needs a balance. It needs some inflammation to fight off different immune triggers, okay? And it also enhances alertness. So if you ever gotten that spike of adrenaline, you know how all of a sudden your focus is enhanced and you're kind of ready to go, right? Now, I did do a previous video, an article on cortisol. So if you want more information on that, go ahead. I will leave that in the video description as well. You can click on that link. But those are some of the physiology responses of cortisol. Now, the adrenal glands also produce the hormone DHEA and mineralocorticoids. And these are in a different mineralocorticoids. They help regulate minerals, and they are related to blood pressure and electrolyte balance. Now, these can be negatively impacted by chronic stress as well and exacerbate cortisol imbalances. And when stress is long-term, cortisol levels can become too high, in things such as diabetes, elevated lipids, high blood pressure, nervous system dysregulation, mental health issues, and osteoporosis can result. That's from cortisol. So we got this dysregulation in our HPA axis, but just long-term high cortisol levels where that stress response doesn't shut down can cause these effects in and of itself. Now, if cortisol becomes too low, then hence we get its own set of problems. Now, this is where the term adrenal fatigue comes in. Now, to start us off, I kind of want to go through a little bit about stress and adrenal dysregulation. Now, Isabella Wentz, she's a pharmacist, a functional pharmacist. She wrote a book, and this is probably going to spur someone who despises personifying organs because it's entitled Adrenal Transformation. But she actually has clinical experience in treating people with chronic low functioning, which she calls adrenal dysregulation. And she talks about how chronic stress can lead to this adrenal dysfunction, and it can cause many bodily issues that we discussed. And these also include mental health disorders, specifically highlighting anxiety. So when there's enough stress and the HPA axis becomes overwhelmed, it can become desensitized to this feedback mechanism in the HPA axis. And so it stops sending messages to the adrenals to produce more hormones or less hormones, even if it needs to, okay? And it can also change the susceptibility at the receptor sites. Now, other common causes of adrenal dysfunction can be sleep deprivation, blood sugar dysregulation, one of my favorites, because a lot of people are maybe they're overdoing fasting, or especially women, they're letting their blood sugars get too low. That can be chronic stress on your hormones. And then chronic inflammation. These are all forms of stress on the body. Anxiety is a hallmark symptom of adrenal dysfunction. Now, she says that when the adrenals are compromised, your resilience to stress starts to go down and you start to feel more anxious. And then the two are linked because anxiety can cause adrenal dysfunction because you're more anxious, and then adrenal dysfunction can cause you to be more anxious. So then another connection in this is also thyroid, because when your cortisol goes low, that impacts your thyroid function, and it also impacts the immune response to your thyroid. There's an autoimmune condition called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So that's kind of how those are all linked. Now, what is adrenal fatigue or this adrenal dysregulation actually referring to? Now, the term adrenal dysfunction is probably more smiled upon in the medical acceptable, precise wording. But remember our leaky gut conversation. There was an article in 2013, Dr. Wilson wrote an article called Clinical Perspective on Stress, Cortisol, and Adrenal Fatigue. And a lot of what I'm going to cite is from that article. He talks about how adrenal fatigue has appeared in medical literature for various names for hundreds of years, and it's starting to get attention now. This was in 2013. So if you're watching this in real time, it was about 10 years ago. And even though that it frequently occurs where people have these low functioning adrenal glands, or there's this dysregulation and this feedback loop between the cortisol response that's proper and what the actual stressor is in the signaling molecules, many doctors are not aware of it or don't view it as an issue, right? Because there's no pathology, there's no actual disease process yet. But the role of cortisol is tightly regulated, and it's important because it's crucial in maintaining health. We talked about this, the roles of cortisol. So that's why it's defined in such a narrow range in the body. If levels drop too low, signs and symptoms of adrenal fatigue are going to occur. And then if they drop way too low, that's where you get an actual disease called Addison's disease, and that can be life-threatening. Okay, so there's adrenal fatigue, and then there's like Addison's disease. Okay, if levels go too high, that can cause metabolic syndrome and various disorders and an imbalance with high cortisol levels. Goes pathologically too high, then you get a disease, right, called Cushing's syndrome. So Dr. Wilson even has in his article that adrenal fatigue is not a disease. He shows that and points that out with a different spectrum, right? The optimal functioning prior to getting the disease. A lot of the controversy with conventional medicine and integrative medicine is people think that we're diagnosing a spectrum of non-optimal functioning is a disease process, and we're not. What we're saying is we're trying to prevent the disease process from occurring. So if we can come in where the adrenal glands are functioning at a suboptimal level, or this HPA dysregulation is occurring, think of all the things downstream that we could be preventing. So it's basically adrenal fatigue is a suboptimal functioning of the adrenal glands where inappropriate or low amount of cortisol is being produced. It's not Addison's disease, and it's usually caused by various stressors or an infection or even other stressors that we talked about, blood sugar dysregulation. Whatever it is, the stress exceeds the capacity of the adrenals to secrete the sufficient amount of hormones it needs for physiological and biochemical compensation of the amount of stress that happens. That is adrenal, quote unquote, fatigue, as it was originally, or one of the most referenced to be defined as. So remember, he is not saying that it is a disease, that it has been in the literature even before 2013, and other names is adrenal dysfunction, adrenal dysregulation, hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis dysregulation. That's been in the literature. He also explained, again, it's a physiological dysregulation, not a disease process. I want to get that kind of drilled into people. So maybe if it was worded hypofunction of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis with a lower level of cortisol, it might have been come into more favor with medical terminology, and people might have been more comfortable with the concept of adrenal fatigue, and it wouldn't be attacked as a bad thing. The problem is, I think, with medical terminology and with people getting hyperbolic and phosphorylated with all of these phrases, is when something is made easy to understand for a layperson, it might not be the most precise, but it can be helpful, right? And it can be helpful in explaining that to our clients, to our patients. And if it's helping them and helping them understand things, then maybe we need to take that into consideration and save our precision. And I'm guilty of this too. Our physiology pathways and all of that preciseness for our scientific literature. That being said, accuracy is important. Overdiagnosis can happen. People can attribute just fatigue and chronic tiredness to this adrenal fatigue when really there's maybe some underlying pathology that really is there, or something, that isn't there. That's where correlating the patient's symptoms and the client's symptoms to lab tests, to their whole person, right? Their whole personhood, sometimes I say, as well as, their compilation of other symptoms. That takes a physician, that takes somebody that's trained in medicine to do. So you always want to rule that out with conventional standard of care medicine. And then you can also, when that, you look at some cortisol levels, you look at the symptoms, you look at maybe the adrenal glands, or this correlation of this high chronic stress has caused some low cortisol levels to occur in this individual, and they might need some support. How can we support them? How can we dial back and figure out what the stressors are to help treat the root cause of that? Is it an infection? Is it blood sugar dysregulation? Is it an environmental toxin? Is there an autoimmune process going on? All of these things we need to look at. Okay. So that is what is referred to as adrenal fatigue. We talked about the controversy. We talked about the HPA axis and how it's probably more precisely and better defined as HPA axis dysregulation. But what happens when the downstream effect of that is low cortisol levels, and how that can impact the body. I'm going to continue with this, even though I might get some backlash. I'm going to continue with this topic in another video where I'm going to go over more of the causes and some of the supportive interventions, as well as some of the lab tests. So be sure to stay tuned for that. I want to break it up in chunks so you kind of understand it. And I think it's super important to understand what we're talking about, what we're not talking about, what we're referring to when I'm discussing adrenal dysregulation. But the main point is to help people feel better, if they're exhausted all the time, their cortisol levels are low, and there is truly an issue in this communication symptom between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenals causing downstream effects, let's get at it, right? Before a disease process actually happens. Thank you for listening and taking the time. And thank you for your interest in integrative medicine, naturopathic and functional medicine. Be sure again to check out the reference and resources in the video description. I will have those all there for you. Subscribe to my newsletter. You will also get notice of any announcements or programs that I'm running in the courses that I teach and offer to both colleagues and practitioners, as well as the consumer. All right. Have a wonderful day. Take gentle care of yourself or night whenever you're watching this, and I will be back soon with part 2.